Hi, everyone. What I want to argue is that the tragedy and chaos that we've seen in the so-called migrant crisis in Europe is not inevitable. That the over 3,000 lives that were lost crossing the Mediterranean last year, the collapse in human rights standards across Europe, and the suffering we've seen on the Greek islands and across the Balkan route and in places like Italy are problems of our own making. And I want to suggest that in order to address them, we need to confront a very simple but misguided assumption held by so many policymakers and large parts of the media in Europe and elsewhere. And that assumption is that refugees have to be an inevitable burden to their host societies rather than potential contributors. But to overcome that assumption, we need a paradigm shift. Rather than just seeing refugees as a humanitarian issue, which of course it is, we also have to see it as a development issue, an economic issue, and recognize that refugees have skills, talents, aspirations, and the ability to be a benefit to their societies. And if we can do that, we can empower both refugees and citizens in the receiving countries. So to make that very simple argument, I want to take you on a little bit of a journey, which will start in Europe, go to East Africa, go to the Middle East, and then end up back in Europe. This photograph looks rather like it could have been taken in the last couple of years on the Balkans route to Europe. But it was actually taken 17 years ago, in 1999. And it illustrates a time when some 400,000 predominantly Muslim Kosovar refugees made their way to Europe and were largely welcomed, in many cases contributed, and in most cases ultimately went home and rebuilt their society. At the time, I was an undergraduate student with not much money and a lot of free time, and I didn't know much about the refugee issue. But with a summer of free time, I volunteered to go to an asylum seeker reception center in the Netherlands, where I expected to be confronted with a sense of pity and great sympathy. But actually the opposite struck me, a sense of awe and inspiration, because I met people with incredible abilities to contribute. People from former Zaire, China, Iran, Iraq, Liberia. And amongst them, I met, for instance, an Iranian Olympian who taught me table tennis. I met a Bosniak lawyer who taught me the basics of international public law. But the tragedy was at the time in the Netherlands, many of them would spend 3, 4, 5 years in limbo before they would be able to work and be recognized as refugees. And that struck me as an incredible tragedy. But as I traveled, that challenge replicated. All around the world, refugees were denied the right to work. Did you know, for instance, that today, over half of the world's refugees are in so-called protracted refugee situations? They've been in camps or in exile for at least 5 years. And of those in such situations, the average length of exile is 26 years. This photograph is the Ali Ade refugee camp, an awful camp in Djibouti, near the border with Somaliland. And there, when I traveled, I met the guy you see in front of the blackboard, Wooly. And he's been in the Ali Ade camp since 1989. He arrived as an 18-year-old, and he's still there. And what Wooly is doing is he's providing informal education to youth who don't have access to formal secondary education by teaching them with a blackboard and a piece of chalk, English and basic maths. And what Wooly said to me when I met him was, man doesn't live on food and water alone, but on hope. My hope is gone, but I pass it to the next generation. And that illustrated to me both the tragedy of a waste of humanity and talent, but also the incredible innovation to adapt under significant constraints and make the best for themselves and their societies. So in response to that, I started to work as an academic on some of these questions. But I think in order to understand the refugee challenge, we've got to recognize that it's a geographically concentrated challenge, that most refugees are not in Western Europe, they're not in North America, they're not in Australia. They're in developing regions of the world. And around 50% of the world's refugees come from just 3 countries, Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. And nearly 60% of the world's refugees are hosted by just 10 countries, none of which are in Western Europe. But the response we have today is an outdated response. It's one that was created in the early part of the Cold War for European refugees displaced in the aftermath of the Second World War. And it's an institutional framework stuck in a time warp. These people negotiated the 1951 Refugee Convention, an indispensable document that recognizes that nobody fleeing persecution or serious harm should be sent back to their country of origin. But it's a document and an institutional framework that is struggling in the face of a new set of challenges. The 1951 Refugee Convention defines a refugee as someone fleeing persecution. Originally, it was intended to ensure that nobody would be sent back to communist countries. But today, rather than fleeing tyrannical governments out to get people, although this is part of the problem, most refugees are fleeing mass violence. They're fleeing fragile and failed states, like Syria, like Somalia, like Afghanistan. And the inability of the world to update its model is leading to tragedy. It leads to inconsistency. If you're an Eritrean refugee, you have an 100% chance of being recognized as a refugee in Sweden, but a 24% chance of being recognized in France. For long periods of time, Somalis would not be recognized as refugees in several European countries like Germany because there was no persecuting state. It's not that they faced any lesser degree of significant harm or their right to life. It was simply that they didn't fit an antiquated definition. And today, in its response, the refugee model is failing. Did you know, for instance, that in Turkey, the country with more refugees than any other country in the world, 2.6 million, less than 10% of refugees receive any assistance from international organizations or NGOs. They effectively have to help themselves. So if you're a refugee today, the refugee regime, these institutions, effectively leave you with three choices. Choice number one is that you can go to a refugee camp. This is the Zaatari refugee camp, home to 83,000 Syrians in Jordan. It's not a nice place to be because you don't have the right to work, there's no freedom of market exchange. At night, you can hear the mortars on the other side of the border. And so understandably, less than 9% of Syrians actually choose to live in a camp. Many more, around 75%, choose to move to urban and peri-urban areas in neighboring states, cities like Amman and Beirut. But there, they struggle to get work permits. They often don't have the formal right to work, and they end up in destitution. So it's understandable that many take the risk to embark on very dangerous journeys in the way that we've seen in Europe over the last couple of years. But I want to suggest that it can be very different from this. And there's one country that's doing things rather differently. And that country is Uganda, a country that does have many challenges, but in the refugee area has been pioneering. Uganda, unlike other host countries in Africa, gives refugees the right to work and freedom of movement. So it allows us in research terms to explore what happens when we give refugees basic socioeconomic freedoms. It hosts 500,000 refugees from countries like Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, and Rwanda, but it's adopted a different model. So what we did with my team in Oxford is we trained refugees as peer researchers, as enumerators. We collected qualitative data and quantitative data to show what could be different. This photograph illustrates the Nakivale settlement, home to 100,000 refugees from different communities. It's an image that probably challenges your conception of a refugee camp. It's a vibrant market where refugees are buying and selling wares and setting up small-scale businesses. In the settlement, you see, for instance, transportation companies. The main bus company that goes between the Nakivale settlement and the capital, Kampala, 4 hours away, is run by Somali refugees. A Congolese refugee is running a computer games parlor with recycled televisions and games consoles, charging youth a small fee in order to play FIFA, in many cases FIFA 12, because they're a little out of date. There are shops that are selling everything from tuna fish imported from Thailand via Saudi Arabia, through Mombasa, and into the Awino market in Kampala. And our data challenged 5 fundamental myths, popularly held by the media and the public about the economic lives of refugees. First, that refugees are economically isolated. They're not. Even in the settlements, you see fabric like this brightly colored ceremonial fabric sold by the Congolese called bitenge. When we asked NGO workers where it came from, they said it comes across the border from Congo. But when we asked refugees, they said they were importing it from warehouses as far afield as India and China. They were part of the global economy with supply chains that went across the planet. Secondly, we challenged the myth that refugees are an inevitable burden. In Kampala, some 21% of refugees run a business that employs at least one other person. And of those they employ, 40% are citizens of the host country. Refugees are making jobs. This photograph illustrates a street in the Kisenyi, Somali-dominated area of Kampala. And along that street are businesses mainly run by women, single female-headed households. And they've formed what's called an ayuto, a collective, where they pay a share of their income into a collective pool, and when one of them hits hard times, they can withdraw through an informal social protection scheme. We were able to challenge the myth that refugees are economically homogenous. Yes, the average income is relatively low at $29 a month in Uganda, but there's huge variation around that. Demuke is a Congolese refugee. He arrived with very little, but he's built a community radio station. He makes documentary films with a camera hired on a short-term basis and responds to commissions from researchers like us. We were able to challenge the myth that refugees are technologically illiterate. They extensively use SMS technology, and not just to stay in touch with friends and relatives, but as part of their core livelihoods activities, for business information, to transfer money, and wherever it's available, broadband is widely used. We also see informal, low-level technologies. This bicycle has been converted into a tool sharpening device. As I found, if you cycle it backwards, you get sparks in your face, but that's only something that happens to foolish Oxford academics. Refugees are not dependent. We found that less than 1% of households have no independent income-generating source. You can't live on World Food Programme rations anywhere in the world, so you have to make ends meet. And this photo illustrates a social enterprise set up by a Ugandan entrepreneur, Moses Musasi, making a female sanitary product called the Macapad, which is made in the refugee settlements and sold to the UN Refugee Agency to distribute amongst refugees, a viable, sustainable business created by Ugandan, creating jobs for refugees. In terms of the number crunching, our data has shown a number of factors determine whether refugees survive or thrive. First amongst those is the regulatory environment. The more integrated and the greater socioeconomic opportunity refugees get, the better they will do. Education is crucial. As you go through education from primary to secondary to tertiary, the returns on education increase almost exponentially. The more we educate refugees, the better they will do and the greater the contribution they will make. Occupation matters. We assume refugees are inevitably agriculturalists or farmers. Those that do best are not the agriculturalists or the farmers. They're the entrepreneurs in non-agricultural areas. Years in exile matters. Unfortunately, the longer people stay in exile, the greater the attrition on their skills and their income levels over time. Gender is crucial. Women are being marginalized from labor markets and from economic opportunities. But of course, most host states are not like Uganda. There are political restrictions on the right to work. So what about the Middle East? What does this model mean for elsewhere in the world? Well, one challenging country is Jordan, home to at least 600,000 Syrian refugees. And this is the model that exists at the moment, a relatively new camp called Azraq. It's a sort of high modernist hell, if you like. A new camp set up with line after line of shipping container, with no market activity, and one supermarket, a Jordanian supermarket, given the monopoly by the international community. How do we persuade a country like that to give refugees the right to work? It's difficult. But last April, I traveled with my colleague, the development economist Paul Collier, to the Zaatari refugee camp. And we made a discovery that just a 15-minute drive from the camp was a new special economic zone called the King Hussein bin Talal Development Area. And the government had invested $100 million connecting it to the electricity grid, connecting it to road networks, but it lacked two things: labor and foreign direct investment. So we put two and two together and probably made five, and suggested, well, why couldn't refugees from Zaatari work alongside host nationals? And since then, we've worked with the British government, the Jordanian government, the World Bank, and created a trade carve-out through the European Union to create a pilot that's now providing work permits to Syrians to work alongside Jordanian nationals. It's in an early phase. Thank you. And it's important to recognize this is a second-best solution. It's not the ideal. Full economic participation along the Ugandan model would be the ideal, but we need to think outside the box, be creative, and invest in refugees. In Europe, it's also a huge challenge. In Germany, one of the most welcoming countries in Europe, the employment rate amongst Syrian refugees to arrive last year is between 8 and 10%, compared to the average amongst the migrant population of about 70%. In Germany, a certification society, a high-quality export society, providing jobs is difficult. But Germany is investing. It's making a choice to recognize that most people who arrived are youth, aged between 18 and 30. They can be trained, they can be skilled, and ultimately, they can make a contribution. If you're interested in what I've said, there's a merciless plug at the end for 2 books, one coming out next week with my colleagues on the Uganda model called Refugee Economies, and a book coming out next April called Refuge, Transforming a Broken Refugee System. Thank you very much for listening.